Welcome to Shooting Straight with A1F.com. I'm Frank Miniature, the editor-in-chief of the NRA's America's First Freedom. Today we're again speaking to John Lott, founder and CEO of the Crime Prevention Research Center, author of many fine books. And John, you're always in the middle of something, and we were talking recently, and you were on a 10-hour drive from Montana to Oregon to go and testify, and they kind of let you testify, but not really. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, well, the testimony was supposed to originally be on a Wednesday. I found out on Saturday that the Democrats had moved it up till Monday. And I figured, well, it was like $1,300 to fly from Missoula to Portland. And I just thought it'd make more sense to drive out there. So on Sunday, I started driving. I was in Oregon, not all the way to Portland on Sunday night around midnight, and I got a message from one of the two Republican senators. There are 2 Republicans and 3 Democrats on the Senate Judiciary Committee there, telling me that, because before they said, look, we're allowed 1 invited guest, and we'd like you to be our invited witness there on this. And the Democratic chair told them late on Sunday night, when I was right most of the way there, that I was not approved. They would not let me be the Republican witness that was there, that the Democratic chair was going to pick who their witness was going to be.
You were an expert witness, but what was being debated? What was the law that they were talking about?
Well, in November, Oregon had passed Measure 114, which set up registration, licensing, training requirements for people owning a gun. And that initiative has been held up in the courts.
The NRA is sued.
Right. And so they have kind of a fix-it bill that also makes it much worse in many ways. So I think it was like a $60 fee originally to get a license to own a gun. Now they want it to be $150. They're increasing the amount of training that's there. My most conservative guess is it's at least 200, probably 250 or more to go through the training requirements that are there. So you're talking about $350, $400 to go and get a license now. It also will raise the age to be able to go and own a gun to 21, and it has numerous other things that are in there. And so the Republicans were hoping that I could go and touch on those different issues that were there. And so anyway, it was kind of funny. So the 2 Republican senators wanted me. The chair cited an article from Media Matters and something from Bloomberg's The Trace attacking me, saying that I wasn't qualified to be an expert because, to be honest, I was actually disappointed that Bloomberg's The Trace didn't like me. I thought they were one of my fans. And Media Matters, I was shocked that they had something negative about me in Media Matters. But anyway, so then they reached out. The Democratic chair wanted an NRA representative to do it. And I was hurt. I mean, how come the NRA doesn't have negative articles? I mean, I'm sure they do have lots, but it just shows how arbitrary it was. But the thing is, the NRA representative couldn't be there because she had already agreed to testify at that time in Idaho.
Which they may have known. I'd have to look into that, but right.
I have no idea.
So there's a lot of machinations going on here. And so they don't really want you to speak. They don't want this side there.
Yeah. They ended up getting somebody from the from the NSSF to speak. But the Republicans wanted me to do it. And so anyway, so that's they have this expert testimony, and then they have public hearing later on that day. And so I was allowed to testify in the public hearing. But the Democratic chair ruled that the Republicans weren't allowed to ask me any questions. So, a number of places, like if you testify in Congress, they limit you to 5 minutes, but then you answer questions. Or I was in Maryland earlier this year. I only was allowed to speak for 2 minutes, but then I had like 43 minutes of questions from the senators that were there from both parties, similar in other states. But it's just so bizarre. I mean, here you just have the Republicans. They just have to sit up there, and they can't even ask questions of the person that they wanted to have as a witness. And then some of the people that came after me wanted to let me have their time he said, well, we're not going to increase the total amount of time, but we'd like Lott to have our time to continue to speak. And the chair, ruled that out, so I'm not going to give Lott more time.
That's common in congressional hearings. Well, they'll grant their 5 minutes to someone else to let them speak.
Oh, yeah, no, I've had it happen in other states, too, because the whole thing about the limit was so they don't have to be there for 50 hours to go and listen to people speak. And so if somebody's going to speak anyway and they're already there, it's not like it increases the total amount of time. But look, we're getting to the point where they don't even want to have the normal courtesy of debate over the political topics that are there. So I made some points, but I could have made a lot more.
I think you did a great job in those 2 minutes. You went right after the main topic, how they're disenfranchising a certain segment of the population that can't afford, potentially, these permits to go through this process.
Right. Well, I mean, to put it in the most forward terms, the rule is basically racist and anti-poor. So you're going to have, let's say, $400 or something around there to go and get your license to own a gun. They just doubled last year the cost of getting a concealed carry permit. So you add those together, you're talking about something around $500 or more maybe to do that. Who do they think they're stopping from getting guns? It's not wealthy people who live in the suburbs that they're stopping from doing it. It's going to be basically the people who are most likely victims of crime, poor people, particularly minorities, particularly blacks. And, people that my research shows who benefit the most from owning guns, and because they're the most likely victims of violent crime. And I try to go after that, but that's not the only thing. So they have a 60-day waiting period once you've fulfilled the requirements to go and get a license before it's granted. You have to go and get training beforehand. I'm sure in many states you sign up for a class and it could be 30 or 60 days before you can even do the class that's there. And then, so that's saying that's 90 or 120 days. Plus then they have other little things, like even once you buy the gun, there's a 72-hour waiting period that they put on there. And so my point was, look, you have a woman who's being stalked or threatened. In Oregon, because they have these universal background checks, if a woman calls me up on an evening saying that her ex is threatening her, I can't loan her my gun. If I loan her my gun, I'm committing a felony for doing that in the state. And now she can't go and get a license to buy a gun. It could be 90, 120 days or whatever. That may be, 90 or 120 days too long for her to be able to go and protect herself. So those are among the points I was making. The other point I made really briefly, because it was after my 2 minutes was up and he wasn't letting me talk too long, was the whole point of licensing and registration they have there is supposedly to solve crimes, okay? We have registration and licensing in other places. Hawaii's had registration and licensing since the 1960s. You've had it in Chicago, you've had it in Washington, D.C., you've had it in Pennsylvania on handguns, you have it in Maryland and New York have had registration, licensing, ballistic fingerprinting that they had for 15 years before they dropped it. I was just pointing out, you look at these places, you can't find one crime that these systems have solved, despite the claim that this is the reason for it. It's a pretty simple reason. And that is, in theory, if somebody leaves a gun at a crime scene and it's registered to the criminal, then you can go and trace it back to the criminal that's there. The problem is, crime guns are almost never left at the scene. And the few times that they are left at the scene, it's because the criminal's either been killed or seriously wounded, so you've already caught them. And the couple additional times that they're left there, they're not registered to anybody. And the once or twice that they are registered to somebody, they're not registered to the person who committed the crime. And so, but it costs a lot. So some time ago, I testified in Hawaii before the state legislature when they were talking about changing the registration license rules. And before I went there, I knew the Honolulu police chief was supposed to be the person to testify in favor of the law changes. And so I told the legislators who were inviting me, I said, you got to tell them in advance you're going to ask him 2 questions, because I don't want him to say he can't answer them. And the first question is, how many crimes have you been able to solve as a result of registration and licensing, and to go back as far as you can. And the second question is, how much does it cost? And when he got up there, he said he couldn't find any crimes that they'd been able to solve. And then when they asked him how much it cost, he said he didn't have a dollar figure, but he estimated it took, this is just for Honolulu, he estimated it took 50,000 hours worth of police time each year to go and run the registration thing. So at least if there was like 50,000 hours, you could solve a lot of crimes with that. So at least if you'd been able to point to thousands of crimes that you've been able to solve, there'd be some trade-off, or hundreds, or a dozen, or 3, then you could say, I'm giving up 50,000 hours worth of police time that I could use for normal policing, and I got 3 crimes I've solved.
So if they were focused on the bad guys, investigating, looking for the criminals, arresting them, prosecuting them, going through that process with
They'd
the same
get rid
amount
of the
time,
registration, and they'd have the police doing other things that we know work.
instead of targeting guns in this
In New
arbitrary
York,
way.
where you live, they had this ballistic fingerprinting set up and registration and licensing for 15 years. They spent something like $45 million on it. And in New York, they got rid of it, despite their biases in favor of the gun control, because that was $45 million that they couldn't point to one crime that they'd been able to solve. The gun control people said, 15 years isn't long enough. You got to have it in place for longer. Then we'll be able to start solving crimes as a result of it. And that was even too much of an argument for the gun control state legislators in New York to swallow. And it was a pretty massive vote to end the system that they have there. Same thing in Maryland.
And then in Canada, they
Well, yeah.
withdrew their registration process years ago.
Right. Well, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police looked at all registration. They started registration of handguns in the 1930s and the long guns in the 1980s. And in the long guns, they'd spent a couple $2 billion on the system that were there, and they couldn't point to any crimes that they'd been able to solve. For the handguns, they claimed that it was possible that there were 3 crimes that they might have been able to solve, but even those were debatable.
So I'm starting to see why, to bring this back full circle, why these anti-gun legislators in Oregon did not want you to speak. You can tell them it's racist, it's anti-poor, and it doesn't even work anyway.
And it's hurting women, people who benefit the most from guns, and it's just throwing away a lot of money, and just the only thing it's accomplishing is making it costly and difficult for law-abiding citizens to be able to go and get guns. It's not like it's going to stop the gangs in Portland or something like that from getting guns.
Wow. Now, where can people follow you, John, find out more about you, get this truth that the media is unfortunately not reporting very often?
Right. Well, they can go to our website at crimeresearch.org, and it has copies of all the testimony and everything that I've given, and it has our research papers.
Thank you, John.
Well, thank you.